Good rising, brethren. This is Big Judah coming to you guys from California. Before I begin, give all praise to the Most High Yahweh. Acknowledgement to the earthly mother. Who is wisdom? Who is Holy Spirit? Acknowledgement to Yahushai. I pray the Most High blesses this lesson this evening, gives more knowledge and understanding of the events of the past in order to understand events that are currently happening on the earth. We get a much better understanding of the things that are soon to come on the earth. This is part 2 in the series here, talking about white too much, or actually white too long, and how, you watched part 1. He gave a great breakdown of a lot of information. Like I said, it's you can see how it's just building. You got the Christians who have no idea about their history and that are emotionally attached to everything that they've been told, but they refuse to do any research. This guy right here, Robert P. Jones, is bringing out true history of the church, true history of what they've been able to do, how they've been manipulating things behind the scenes. The priests of Muhammad have been using these churches to manipulate their way to pretty much oppressing the Most High's chosen people. And how these people just walk through life with no clue of what's been happening. Talking about how one of his grandfathers, like 6 generations back, was given 200-acre plots of land as like a pretty much, paying him for his service in the war. How many other people receive these kinds of plots of land that they've been handing down from generation to generation? I mean, that's a huge leg up. 200 acres of land. You imagine how expensive that land is now. So I backed up to around the 14-minute mark just for a little bit of review, and we can go ahead and continue from there. But as you can see, before we get started, one more time, he's given his, historical information, but he does not connect that to the Bible. He does not connect all this historical information he's bringing out to the curses and the beginning of the tribulation period for the Hebrew Israelites. But see, that's not his job to. That's our job. Everyone's been given directions and, as to what it is they're supposed to accomplish while they're here. Our job is to connect these events to Scripture, not just the Bible, because when people say Scripture, they're mostly referring to the Bible. It's referring to other books that have been hidden. Remember now, these people have been the ones that have been hiding all the books. All the books that tell on them, they hide. That's why they're the ones that are playing God. Anytime they're saying we don't accept those books like they're God and what they say goes, shows you that they've usurped the power of the Most High and they've taken it on themselves. Like, the Most High gives us information. He's the one that ultimately approves information, not Christians, not Gentiles, not evangelicals, not Catholics. So anytime you hear that, well, we don't accept that, I don't accept that. Well, hey, you must think you know more than God then. Now let's do our job and continue to bring out more knowledge and understanding as he brings out this history.
Benefits from was Native American land in Georgia that he was able to. So I mean that story is certainly there. The other, I think, piece of this is that white Christianity doesn't invent this sense of white supremacy when it lands on the shores of the U.S.
And this is very important. The evangelicals, there were no such thing as evangelicals. The Reformation. He's telling you this is from the Catholic Church. This is from the popes. They're the ones that made up this whole thing with going around and taking other people's lands. Anyone that's not white, you can take their land. This is all coming from the Catholic Church. But hey, trust me, the evangelicals love the benefits that they got from it. They always talking a mess about the Catholic Church, but when it comes to white is right and we can take whatever we want, they love that part of the Catholic Church. That's why we always say, Catholics, Christians, you guys are all the same. You're all white supremacists.
It goes much further back than that. You can go back as far as the 15th century, even prior to prior to the Protestant Reformation, with the Doctrine of Discovery, which is 1493, which we have a papal edict that says if white European missionaries and explorers show up on other lands that are occupied by people who do not practice the Christian faith, they can forcibly take those lands and consider that to be condoned by the church and by God. And so this was 1493, right? And this is like way back. And so the doctrine of manifest destiny, this sense of kind of entitlement, and that it's not just sort of that is divinely ordained, right? It really is seen to be the will of God, right? That this is the role of white Europeans in the world, is to quote unquote civilize others and to see themselves at the top of the racial hierarchy. It's all the way back. So it's built in even as white Christians, land on the shores of the early colonies here in the U.S.
So in your own journey, what came first? Like, were you looking digging into your own story, or did the research come first and it led you to look deeper into your own story? What came first?
Yeah, I think it's hard to really put a finger on it. Really, I mean, I think like many people, it's a kind of organic process. I would certainly say the seeds of it are, my parents, who very clearly, while they weren't like political activists and weren't overtly kind of, I think, educating us, to be anti-racist, but they were certainly putting some distance between my brother, my sister, and I, and the Jim Crow South that they grew up in, in Macon, Georgia. So I think having that buffer that gave me just enough critical distance, I think, to kind of see it from the outside and not be so immersed with it that it's hard to see out of it. I think that was absolutely critical. I think having, professors that were really important in my life, and a Baptist professor at a Southern Baptist seminary, who in fact was the first Baptist professor to put in a textbook the real reason for the founding of the denomination. That textbook was published in the 1980s. Like, that tells you how late it was.
See that textbook published in 1980s. Look at all that history that they've hidden, and they barely even put into a textbook in the 1980s. But that's the Most High. As we got closer and closer to the end, more information was being released. And that releasing of that information, was set up for us. Was set up for the chosen Gentiles to be able to see the truth and be able to turn from their ways.
That even, a Baptist historian would be frank about the cause of the Civil War, a guy named Leon Macbeth. So I owe, and then, and a lot of cognitive dissonance for decades that I think I sat with, and coming in and out of view, very messy in a process. I do think that, it's crystallized more. I think my graduate education certainly, helped, reading, tons of folks like Cone and Cornell West, and many other folks that certainly I didn't have connections with growing up. So reading a lot of African American theology that really did change my views on some of this. And then I think the last 5 years have really been critical, where I think things that even previous to 5 years would have been.
And calling us out of our name is really going to get them in a lot of trouble. They're keeping on calling us African Americans, blacks, and it's like they use the word black so much more now. And when you're going to hear about how the history works out right now, he's going to be explaining a little bit. You're going to see some reasons why they keep calling us black and calling themselves white, and what that really meant. So they just love to call us out of our names, but that's okay. I said that's going to open up more punishment for them. The more they keep calling us bywords and ignoring who they are, the more they open themselves up to the destruction of the Most High.
They certainly were there. They hadn't gone away, but things that I think were either whispered or said in dog whistle code words coming out right into the open, right, where we see white supremacy just right in front of us without apology. Those chants in Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us, blood and soil, the neo-Nazi slants, and again, like Dylan Roof murdering 9 African Americans at Bible study, right, and doing it in the name of his own twisted version of white Christianity. I mean, it
now, yeah, they try to make it seem like his own version of white twisted Christianity. That's not the first time that you guys have done those kinds of things based off of your Christianity. He's just carrying, that guy who killed Dylan Roof, I think what his name was, he's just carrying on what he's been taught in these Christian churches the whole time. Don't try to like make it seem as if that's not what's taught in these Christian churches, that they can do whatever it is that they want and they can get away with it. That's painfully clear with what happened at the Capitol a few weeks ago, and how they're trying to decide if they really want to prosecute people because they're sorry. They feel like it was a big mistake. We made big mistakes. We didn't get a chance to say we're sorry and get off. People always say, well, we got to follow the law. Well, that's what they should be doing now with these people. But they're still in their blessing for a little while longer, so we'll see what happens.
It was very much wrapped up in his religious views, not just in his racist views. These were one and the same thing for him. And trying to take that really seriously and ask ourselves, okay, like, if we're going to reckon with this, like, how do we start doing that? How do we start telling the truth? And I think we mentioned Baldwin at the top of the show here. Baldwin, I think, was also someone I read who really changed my mind about many things. And I would say opened my eyes. And one of the things I think he challenged me to do was to do what he saw his own writing doing, and that was bearing witness. Like, he kind of used this Christian language of bearing witness to the truth as best he could see it. And I think it's one of the most admirable things about him, in addition to his immense gifts as a writer, was his courage and willingness to just not flinch and tell us the truth as straight as he could see it. And I think I certainly have been kind of challenged and inspired to try to do the same thing from where I sit. And so I think a lot of the book I do see is just trying to bear witness to the truth in a way that might start a different set of conversations and actions that can.
And that's the thing, bearing witness to the truth. But you got, Most High is giving you guys an opportunity, you Gentiles, an opportunity to bear witness to the truth. You're not going to be able to go to the Most High on your own terms. You're going to have to bear witness to the truth. Admit the truth. We're not trying to get you to have a conversation. So you guys always say that so we can have a conversation. We don't want to have a conversation with you. It's either you accept the truth or you don't. There's no negotiations. We're not the ones you need to negotiate with. Your negotiations, having a conversation, is going to be with our Father. You can't fix what you guys have done for the last few hundred years. So we keep hearing all the time about having a conversation. We're not trying to have a conversation. 2/3 can have a conversation with you. I said, but over here, you can have a conversation with our Father. He's the one that's already set the guidelines as to what's going to happen. He's calling his chosen people. He's calling the chosen Gentiles. If you have the Spirit to bear witness and bear witness to the truth under the Most High's terms, then maybe you have a shot. But thinking you're going to have that we're going to have to come and have a conversation with you guys is like us groveling to you, us on our knees begging for you to acknowledge us. I could care less if you acknowledge us. I'm just sitting here to bring up this information, share it from the perspective the Most High gives me, and you believe it or you don't. Pure and simple.
hopefully get us to a different place.
I believe it will.
And the Most High is going to take us to that different place. The Most High is going to take us from the bottom to the top, and He's going to take the Gentiles from the top to the bottom. That's the place that we're going to. There's no negotiations for you to stay on top and us on the bottom. That's not going to happen.
Get to your research, because I do want to give some time to that, and then I see that there are questions already popping up, so that we can frame this. Like, how are you defining white supremacy, and how are you defining whiteness? And then we can jump into your research.
Yeah. Well, white supremacy. I'll start there. I kind of wrestled a little bit with kind of using the term, mostly because I know that most white people, when they hear the term, think, oh, that's not me, right? There's kind of this immediate defensive reaction, and people think, oh, that's the KKK, that's people burning crosses, that's people lynching people, that has nothing to do with me. And so kind of inoculate themselves from kind of thinking any further about it. I'll borrow a term from Eddie Glaude, who's a professor of African American Studies and Religion at Princeton, who wrote in Democracy in Black, a really great book I'll recommend, as well as he's a new book on James Baldwin, actually, called Begin Again. It's fantastic. But he talked about white supremacy, quote, without all the bluster. And I think that's a good way of thinking about it. It's something much more common, much more banal, really. And so even if we just flip the words around, and instead of white supremacy, where we kind of have this reaction often, we think about it as the supremacy of whites, and just unpack that a little bit further, and make it communal and social. And that is kind of, being in support of a social arrangement that protects and values the lives of whites at the expense of others. I think is really what I mean by that. And if you think about it that way, and you think about everything from restrictive neighborhood covenants that protected all white neighborhoods and better areas of the city, pushed African American neighborhoods near industrial centers and flood zones, like those kinds of things, with worse schools, restricting certain jobs, certain benefits, who could get loans, who couldn't. I mean, it's economic, it's social, it's cultural, it's kind of all the way down. And there's really no way of reading American history straight without realizing that has plagued us for all of our history. It's with us today. Even with COVID-19, right? We have 200,000.
It plagued us, not them. I mean, it didn't plague everybody. It only plagued a certain people. We're the ones who've been bearing the brunt of all of these social ills, all these cultural ills, all of their religious ills. Everything is set up for them. That's out of Proverbs 11:1, and then unjust weights. You cannot get around that. No matter what they say or do, conversation is not going to fix it. There's payback. That's what the Most High is talking about. Vengeance is mine. Because you've done all these things and there's no way to fix it.
Deaths, but those deaths aren't evenly distributed. African American, Latino Americans.
And the thing that they keep talking about, the whole thing with the deaths from COVID or from the plague, deaths have never been distributed equally. This is nothing new. So it's like all of a sudden, you guys all of a sudden figured out that our deaths have been distributed around equally, and now you are unequally, and now you want to fix it. We need to go all the way back to as soon as you stepped foot on our lands. Death and destruction has always been, more on our side, on the black and brown people, the so-called black and brown people that have been inhabiting these lands before you got here. Deaths were never equal. So why all of a sudden now it's such a big deal, I have no idea.
Are twice as likely as whites to have been infected and die of the disease. And I think a lot of the complacency we're seeing among whites, particularly, is really linked to that, that this has impacted communities of color much more than that. And on the issue of whiteness, it's sometimes they use a phrase like, those of us who have grown up thinking of ourselves as white, as one way of kind of thinking about the construct. And it's again, Baldwin, I think here is really instructive, and he talks really about the power that whiteness in particular has had in the American context, right? So he's like, look, when people came over from Germany to America, well, in Germany, those people were German. In France, they were French. In Britain, they were British. And and in Denmark, they were Danes. It's only when they get to America that there is this kind of umbrella category of whiteness that really takes hold. And what it really means, right, is entrance to a protected, privileged category. That where many rights and privileges are kind of constrained here, and everyone else is kind of kept out. And it's also worth noting, I mean, how elastic this category has been throughout.
And that's exactly it. You come over from different countries and you cease to be whatever country you came from. If you are German, British, Irish, Danish, and you come over to America and all of a sudden everybody who's in that group is lumped in with being white. You lose your original heritage and you're given, you're given a label as being white. So therefore you have all these certain privileges that other people who are non-white are left out of. So all these people that keep saying, well, I didn't own slaves, I wasn't a slave owner, doesn't matter. You are in that category of being white, which means you got all of these privileges that the slaves and the people at the bottom did not get. So therefore you don't have to be a slave owner. You still got the privileges. You never said, I don't want those privileges. You just took the privileges, but now you're going to have to pay for that. The level that you have to pay is up to the Most High. But don't sit here and act like you didn't have these privileges this whole time. And now when it's time to pay, the bill's due. Now it's, I'm not like those people. I'm different. The whole system was set up for so-called white people to have all of these benefits. And all the people who actually have been doing all the work have been excluded from that. That's why this video is so important. You can't get off with just, it's only slave owners. No. I said all the people who come over here wanted that piece of that American pie. And if you came from all these different countries, you took your piece of the pie. Now you don't get to say, I have my piece of the pie, but now I don't want to have to pay for it. If you got a bigger piece of the pie, more payments due. Very simple.
About American history, so Jews historically not white, Italians not white, Irish not white. Even on the official U.S. Census forms, well into the 20th century. I mean, if you were Irish, you had to check Celt. If you were Jewish, you had to check Hebrew. You couldn't check Caucasian. Like that was not your box. But these categories have kind of expanded. But always, I think whiteness has been about a kind of protected class that is kind of protected as the top of the pyramid, and certain rights, privileges, and powers reserved for those who could make a claim to that category.
Yeah. There you go. So, you guys don't get to just walk away. You might have came from all these different countries, but when you came here, you assumed, all the great perks that you get for being white. And I looked through society, and I was looking on, what was it? It was on one of the social media pages, and something popped up, and it was talking about how like white girls, would date black guys, but they felt like, when they're dating a black guy, they were on a lower social status. But when the white girls dated a white guy, they felt like he was on like a much higher social status. So hey, you've been the pinnacle of manhood the way you set it up. You set up all the perks for you. You made it so all the women would gravitate to you. I said, and so now all of a sudden you don't want that no more. Now all of a sudden you want to have a conversation for all the bad things you guys have done. Like I said, you can have that conversation with our Father. We've already went through the curses, so what the hell do we want to have a conversation for? We've already served our punishment. We're walking out the prison right now. We're passing you as you're coming into the prison. We're getting freed. You're getting locked up. What kind of a conversation are we supposed to have? This would have been a conversation you would have had 100 years ago. Because y'all were too deep into them blessings. Y'all didn't want nothing to do with having a conversation back then. But now, when you're walking into the prison and we're moving on up and moving on out of these curses and out prison, you want to have a conversation. Not going to happen. Not going to happen.
So in your book, you contend that that white American Christianity's theological core is what protects, it's this structured, protected interest. And so what is that theology? What is that theology that serves to protect this supremacy and whiteness, or the supremacy of whites?
Yeah, so it's a big claim. So I mean, I make a claim in the book that that white Christianity hasn't just been complicit, right? It's not just been sort of an incidental thing, but that it has been actively involved in perpetuating, this idea of white supremacy in the country. And one of the ways of kind of thinking about that is just that it has Christianity has been part of the sort of dominant culture among people of European descent, and so not surprisingly, it has been the tool that has been used to legitimize this worldview. And there's no greater legitimacy you can give something than to claim that it is divinely ordained by the creator of the universe, right? That is one of the most powerful claims you can make about something being legitimate. I mean, who can argue with that, right? If you can really make the case that the creator of the universe has in fact ordained this particular thing. And that was precisely the argument that was made, really. And so it was built in very early. Again, all the way back from the 15th century forward, this has been under the hood of the kind of engine of white Christianity. Has been entangled, and it's been done for so long. I kind of argue in the book that it's actually become embedded really in the DNA of white Christianity today, and we can still see it today. But to the point of so it's not surprising that it's really gotten connected to the theology here in so many ways. And it's not that surprising if you think about what early church looked like in the American colonies that were either supportive of or tolerated the enslavement of other human beings. And in many of those churches, what you had was whites who had enslaved others, bringing enslaved people to church with them, whites sitting in the front, enslaved people sitting in the back. And if you ask yourself, well, okay, what kind of sermon could get preached in that environment? What kind of prayer could get prayed in that environment? What scriptures would get read and which ones would absolutely not get read in that environment?
And you can see that right there, the manipulation of the scriptures. Just like they gave them the slave Bible, where they would omit books. What could you teach in that environment? You can't teach the truth. Can't read that the blacks, so-called black people, your slaves, are the Most High's chosen people, and that they're going through their curses at that time, and that eventually they will get their knowledge back. The Most High will redeem them, and then eventually we will go into slavery for what we did to them. You can't teach that in church. So then what can you teach? Slaves, obey your masters. If you're a good slave, maybe you'll be able to, get into heaven with your slave masters. Pretty much just the same things over and over again. That's why when you go to Catholic Church, they have a missalette, which teaches the same thing every single year, all the time. That's why in the Christian churches, they teach pretty much the same things over and over again. They read Paul, Paul, Paul. That's pretty much all that they actually read, because they can't go into the Old Testament. That's why they say the Old Testament is done away with, because you start getting into the Old Testament, which is what all of the apostles were actually reading. That's what they were referring to. But you would then get, you can't teach that. You start getting into too many scriptures. That's why when they start to read, that's why we couldn't read. We start to read, they start to realize that this book is talking about them. That's why Nat Turner did what he did. They let him read, let him get too much information. Let's continue.
tells you a lot about the early shape of lived Christianity in the country, and that legacy that was built there, for centuries. Not surprisingly, is still with us today. I mean, we've hardly begun to reform the theology. And just one example here, a biblical one. This text of that was used well into the 20th century about the mark of Ham or the mark of Cain, which really did again reinforce this white supremacist worldview. And the way it went was this: that the explanation for the existence of dark-skinned people in the world can be traced to this story of Cain murdering his brother Abel. And when God comes and says, "What's happened to your brother?" and he sort of first denies it, but then God finally pins him down and says, "Okay, you've killed your brother," and he marks Cain. And the text really doesn't say anything about skin color. He just says that he gives him a mark. It doesn't say anything other than that. But white Christians and clergy begin to interpret that passage as the origin of dark-skinned people in the world. Now, what that does, right, is it then gives white Christians one lineage that goes back to Adam and Eve, that is a very noble one, right? That of people that the Creator formed with the Creator's own hands, and the origin of dark-skinned people in the world is a criminal act. Yeah. It is literally the murder of one's own brother. And so there is this kind of tracing the lineage back to not to an original being that the Creator crafted with their own with the Creator's own hands, but with someone who created a criminal act, and then that justified then this moral hierarchy, even, right? That whites had this kind of more noble history, dark-skinned people had this morally suspect history, and then you just read that into the current thing. There's many others I could give, but I mean, I think.
All right, we're going to stop right here. This will be the end of part 2. And we'll get back into this again shortly. Shalom.